Violence is flaring across parts of western Syria as forces of the self-styled Syrian transitional government have clashed with Alawite militias and proceeded to target civilian Alawite communities who had been aligned with ousted Syrian President Bashar al-Assad. The body count is rising and cannot be independently verified at this time. The United Kingdom-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights has assessed more than 1,000 people have been killed in the fighting this week, including 125 fighters aligned with the new Syrian government, 148 fighters aligned with Assad, and some 745 civilians. As these clashes continue, the question remains whether Assad's fall has brought Syria closer to ending its ongoing multi-faction civil war, or simply opened a new phase of the power struggle. The new self-styled Syrian transitional government formed from Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, a Sunni Islamist faction that led the final push last fall to drive Assad from power. HTS formed from Jabhat al-Nusra, which was the Syrian branch of al-Qaeda. To this day, HTS remains designated by the United States as a foreign terrorist organization. The U.S. government, across multiple presidential administrations, had opposed Assad and supported his downfall through both overt and covert means. U.S. efforts to oust Assad had centered around arming and equipping rebel groups like the Syrian Defense Forces, SDF. But these efforts were fraught with concerns about accountability. One of the U.S. government's programs to arm and train Syrian rebels, known as Timber Sycamore, saw U.S.-trained rebels fighting alongside or turning U.S.-supplied weapons over to more radical elements like al-Nusra. U.S. weapons also fell into the hands of the Islamic State, fueling that group's rise to power. While the U.S. government had hoped more moderate factions would bring about Assad's downfall, it was this al-Nusra successor group, HTS, that led the final charge. Despite seeing HTS as a terrorist group, the U.S. government under President Joe Biden took an aloof approach to their ascendancy in post-Assad Syria, even dropping a $10 million bounty against the group's leader, Ahmed al-Shara. In the months since Assad's fall, al-Shara has positioned himself as Syria's new president and has placed many of his HTS allies in top government posts. This HTS-formed transitional government has organized some talks on the formation of a new constitution and reforms for post-Assad Syria, but demanded groups like the SDF disarm in order to gain a seat at the negotiating table. The U.S.-backed SDF rejected these demands and denounced the talks as illegitimate and not representative of all Syrian society. Much of the violence this week has played out in the Latakia region in northwest Syria, along the country's Mediterranean coastline. Latakia has been a historic stronghold of the Alawite ethno-religious sect, an early Arab offshoot of Shia Islam. The Alawites have been an ethnic and religious minority in Syria, but had enjoyed the protection afforded to them by the Assad family, themselves of Alawite descent. Bashar al-Assad and his father, Hafez al-Assad, had maintained power and largely secured the Alawite position since 1971. Throughout the Syrian civil war, which began in 2011, the fighting has often proceeded along sectarian lines. With the Alawites representing about 13% of Syria's population, they often attached their hopes for safety to the embattled Assad regime. Soon after Assad's fall from power, a video began to circulate appearing to show an Alawite shrine in Aleppo being put to the torch. Other reports have emerged indicating HTS-aligned forces have begun to target Alawites for killings. Several Alawite militias have formed in the wake of Assad's fall from power, including groups known as the Syrian Popular Resistance, the Coastal Shields Brigade, and the Guardians of Truth battalions. These groups have taken it upon themselves to resist the HTS-led government. The violence this week appears to have begun as the HTS transition government's forces have pushed into Latakia and Tartus in recent weeks. It cannot be immediately verified exactly what set off the fighting. The Alawite Islamic Council blamed the violence on the Syrian transition government sending its forces into Syria's heavily Alawite northwest coastal regions. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Colonel Mustafa Nifati, a leader of the transition government forces, claimed pro-Assadist elements ambushed his forces near the villages of Beit Anna and Dalia in the Latakia governorate. Following the ambush attacks, the HTS government sent additional troops into the region and began imposing curfews. Amid this expanded crackdown, reports have emerged that the forces of the transition government had begun to turn their guns on unarmed Alawites. Footage shared online purports to show the killings. Now, amid reports of mass killings, hundreds of civilians have since arrived at the Russian-controlled Khmeimim Air Base in Latakia, seeking sanctuary. Geir Peterson, the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria, reacted with alarm to the recent outburst of violence. Peterson said, quote, "While the situation remains fluid and we are still determining the precise facts, there is clearly an immediate need for restraint from all parties and full respect for the protection of civilians in accordance with international law. All parties should refrain from actions that could further inflame tensions, escalate conflict, exacerbate the suffering of affected communities, destabilize Syria, and jeopardize a credible and inclusive political transition," unquote. Still, Bashar has vowed his government's forces will, quote, "continue to pursue the remnants of the fallen regime," unquote. Even amid the reports of civilian killings by his forces, Bashar insisted the Assadist elements would receive fair trials, while those who killed civilians would be dealt with. Bashar has also vowed his government will seek to restrict access to weapons throughout Syria, requiring the war-torn country to trust in the goodwill of its new de facto leadership. So, is Syria better off now than it was under Assad? Can the country move on from this recent violence, or will the power struggle continue for years to come? And what role should the United States play, if any, in guiding post-Assad Syria and preventing continued factional and sectarian violence? If you've watched this far, consider subscribing and leave a comment letting me know what you think.